My talk this morning, as Joe told you, is on Olcott and Blavatsky, Theosophical Twins, and is also subtitled An Essay in Archetypes. Now, in Volume 1 of Old Diary Leaves, Olcott, speaking of Blavatsky and himself, wrote, "We used to speak of ourselves as the Theosophical Twins." His reference to Blavatsky and himself as Theosophical Twins has depths that are not immediately apparent. On the surface, it seems to be just a statement that they were alike with respect to theosophy. However, the expression evokes archetypal reference as well. My remarks this morning, therefore, are an essay or an attempt to explore that evocation by considering four things. First, the nature of archetypes. Second, the extent and meaning of the archetype of the twins. Third, how that archetype applies to Olcott and Blavatsky. And finally, how it applies also to all of us as well. So to begin, part one, archetypes. Like much else in Western thought, the concept of archetypes goes back to Plato. You know, it has been said that all of Western philosophy is merely footnotes to Plato. Plato posited the existence of ideal forms, of which all objects of this world are but poor copies or reflections. Plato's archetypal ideal forms are absolutely real and unchanging. Their reflections in this world are only relatively real and impermanent. Presumably, according to Plato, there is an archetypal tree of which all oaks, pines, palms, elms, and so on are only partial and imperfect reflections. However different those particular trees may seem from one another, they all share the quality of treeness. Those particular variety of trees are all types of the archetype of the tree. Plato's theory of archetypes relates to, and indeed may have developed from, his concern with analyzing language to discover truth. Plato wrote a whole dialogue about the relationship between language and truth, whether the meaning of words correspond to things as they really are or just arbitrary. If we talk about trees, and if we group pines, palms, oaks, elms, and so on within that category, treeness must exist apart from independent trees. Otherwise, our talk has no basis in reality. And then philosophy, so far as it concerns the analysis of language to discover truth, is vacuous. Now, on the other hand, the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung updated and internalized the archetypes. Jung maintained that archetypes are the contents of our collective unconscious mind, developed over the evolutionary ages through the experiences of our ancestors. He believed them to be the common property of our species, and as contents of the unconscious, not to be directly accessible to the conscious mind. Instead, Jung thought that the unconscious archetypes are powerful energies that manifest in the conscious mind through dreams, symbols, visions, and so on. Now, archetypal manifestations in the Jungian sense differ from one culture to another. But in every culture, they are recognizably related to the unconscious archetypal source. Thus, there is a great mother archetype that manifests as Isis in Egypt, Kuan Yin in China, the Venus of Willendorf in Stone Age Austria, the multi-headed Diana of Ephesus, the Virgin Mary in Christianity, Sophia in Gnosticism, Kali in Hinduism, and so on. Different cultural manifestations focus on different aspects of the common unconscious archetype. And so they may appear superficially to be quite different from one another, but they all share some central core quality. In the case of the example just cited, that quality is motherliness. Jung developed his concept of archetypes to explain how some of his patients could dream or doodle complex symbolic images that were essentially the same as those in ancient alchemical manuscripts, which they could not possibly have known. He posited an aspect of the human mind of which we are not directly conscious, but which we inherit from our ancestors, just as we inherit the physical features of our bodies. Plato's archetypes and Jung's archetypes are clearly related concepts, but they're also just as clearly different concepts. What, however, is a theosophical understanding of the concept of archetypes? It is a basic theosophical teaching that every outer shape is modeled on an inner form. What things are is not imposed on them from outside, but develops from their own intrinsic inner natures. In addressing the question of how species came to be different from one another, a question that was raised and answered by Charles Darwin, H.P. Blavatsky refers to, quote, the occult fact of the differentiation of species from the primal astral root types. The term astral, as she used it here, does not have its later, more specific meaning of emotional, which most of us know, but rather here it means simply inner or subtle. These astral or inner root types are the archetypes. Blavatsky goes on to elaborate. She says, whatever natural selection, etc., may affect, the fundamental unity of structural plan remains practically unaffected by all subsequent modifications. The unity of type, common in a sense to all the animal and human kingdoms, is but a witness to the essential unity of the ground plan nature has followed in fashioning her creatures. Now that's quite a remarkable statement, because in it Blavatsky is saying something not unlike what present-day geneticists are saying. Although Darwinian natural selection explains how species come to be different, all species of living creatures are built according to the same, what Blavatsky calls fundamental unity of structural plan. Today, scientists have identified that structural plan as DNA, which is the molecular basis of all heredity. It is nature's ground plan, according to which the physical forms of all creatures are fashioned. A related theosophical understanding is set forth in the following passage. Blavatsky wrote, now pay attention to this is important. Thus every mortal has his immortal counterpart, or rather his archetype in heaven. We've all got an archetype in heaven, that's what she's saying. This means, she goes on, that the former, the mortal, is indissolubly united to the latter, the immortal, in each of his incarnations and for the duration of the cycle of births. Only it is by the spiritual and intellectual principle in him, entirely distinct from the lower self, never through the earthly personality. Now, I realize Blavatsky is often hard to understand, particularly when you hear her rather than read her. So what I think she is saying here is that she's talking about what we usually call our personality and our individuality. Our personality, which is that of this lifetime only, and our individuality being that which continues from lifetime to lifetime. And here she calls our individuality our archetype. It is the immortal and spiritual principle in us, which is manifested or reflected in our mortal, earthly personality. Just as nature has an archetypal ground plan according to which all living creatures are fashioned, so we individually have an archetype, our immortal, spiritual, and intellectual principle, which is reflected in and expresses itself through our mortal physical personality, or rather our series of successive mortal physical personalities. This concept of our individuality as our archetype is expressed also in a wonderful creation myth in the Anthropogenesis volume of the Secret Doctrine. Stanza 17 of that series from the book of Xian recounts the making of the human constitution by a committee. And I maintain that the passage is a satire on all committees. And all of you who have ever been in a committee meeting will recognize what's going on in this little parable. The committee meets and manifests typical committee indecision and ineffectiveness. The committee enthusiastically begins its work. The lunar fathers give us our form, and the earth molds a body for it. The sun gives us our vitality, and certain dhyanis or meditators give us a mirror of our body, also called an astral or inner shadow. A son of the fire god gives us our passions and animal instincts, and those gifts are the basis of our earthly personality. Then, however, it is pointed out. And in this little myth, it doesn't say who points it out. And this is also typical of committee actions, where you're often never quite sure who says what. It is pointed out that human beings need something else. They need, quote, a mind to embrace the universe. But alas, none of the committee can supply that. So evolution has come to a standstill. Suddenly, however, saviors appear like lone rangers on white horses. They are the Manasaputras, a term that means children of the mind. They are the offspring of cosmic intelligence, and they incarnate in the mindless, earthly personalities. Those Manasaputras are our individualities, our archetypes, the real us. We are the Manasaputras. Our personalities, which we usually think of ourselves, are actually only the partial and imperfect reflections of the absolutely real and permanent archetypes, which are our individualities. As Blavatsky says elsewhere, occult philosophy teaches us that the human mind, or lower manas, is a direct ray or reflection of the higher principle, the Noetic Mind. Noetic is an English adjective derived from the Greek noun nous or nous, which refers to the higher mind. The latter, the Noetic Mind, is the reincarnating ego, which old Aryan philosophers called Manasaputra, the sons of mind, or Mahat, the universal cosmic mind. So we are the Manasaputras, we are the archetypes, and our personalities are only imperfect, temporary reflections of that archetype in this world. Part 2, the archetype of the twins. Among the many archetypes that get expressed all over the world in mythologies, literature, legends, and other ways is that of the twins. Now, the archetypal twins are not always embodied as identical genetic twins in the world's symbolic writings. Indeed, The archetypes may be expressed as ordinary siblings, or as friends, or for that matter, as enemies. The archetype may be expressed by two persons related by blood or not, who share certain characteristics, and those shared characteristics justify their being thought of as two persons who have been twinned, that is, closely associated or matched. More particularly speaking, there are two types of archetypal twins: cooperating twins and contending twins. Perhaps the best known example of cooperating twins are the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, in Greek mythology. Dioscuri is a Greek term that might be translated as divine boys. Castor and Pollux were brothers, or rather half-brothers. They were both sons of Leda, but they had different fathers. Castor's father was Leda's husband, Tyndareus, king of Sparta. Pollux's father, however, was the god Zeus, who had taken a fancy to Leda and visited her in the form of a swan. As a result of their different paternities, Castor was mortal, but Pollux was immortal. Yet they were brothers and firm, fast friends. They grew up together. They sailed together with the Argonauts to find the golden fleece. They hunted the Caledonian boar together. Eventually, however, Castor, the mortal brother, was killed in combat. And his immortal brother, Pollux, was desolate. So Pollux went to his father Zeus and begged that he might share his immortality with his mortal brother. He proposed that they be together forever, half the time in Hades, where mortals go when they die, and half the time on Mount Olympus, where the gods live. Zeus was so moved by this sign of fraternal loyalty that he put both boys into the heavens as stars. And there are two stars in the heaven, one named Castor and one named Pollux. And they shine brightly in the constellation called Gemini, the twins. Other examples of cooperating twins are not hard to find. Another prominent example are the Hindu Ashvins, twin horse gods, who are almost certainly historically related to Castor and Pollux, because the early Hindu people and the Greek people are historically related. A Hebrew pair are David and Jonathan. Remember that archetypal twins need not be genetic twins or even related, but instead may be soulmates. A recent example are the biological twins Fred and George Weasley in the Harry Potter series of books. Some cooperating twins are much like one another. Fred and George Weasley are examples. Even their parents can't tell them apart. Others contrast sharply in some way. Of the Dioscuri, Castor is mortal and Pollux is immortal. But contending twins are also widespread. The most famous Western examples of the archetype are Cain and Abel. Cain, a farmer, slew his brother, a herdsman. A similar pair are Romulus and Remus, twins suckled by a wolf. Romulus set out to found the city of Rome, but when Remus made fun of his early efforts, Romulus killed him. In Iran, Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, emanated two spirits, Spentamayu and Angramayu, the Holy Spirit and the destructive spirit, who are at eternal odds with one another. In Egypt, Osiris is killed and his body is mutilated by his evil twin, the god Set. Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is unusual in that the contending twins are different aspects of the same person. A theme also used in Ursula Le Guin's novel, Wizard of Earthsea, in which Geb and his shadow are the same entity. The best known example of contending twins in current literature, which I'm going to mention because this is Harry Potter month, are Harry Potter and Voldemort, who are not even the same generation, but who share parts of their souls and bodies with each other, and so are literally soulmates and blood brothers, as those who have read Book 4 will know. In some cases, twins who might seem to be contending end up as cooperating. The Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh provides an example. Gilgamesh is a great king of the city of Uruk. He represents civilization, order, and cultivation. Enkidu is a disorderly wild man who lives among animals and roams in the wilderness. Enkidu attacks Gilgamesh, who is in almost every way his opposite. But in the resulting contest, Gilgamesh wins by strength and strategy, thus indicating that order and civilization, represented by Gilgamesh, overcome disorder and primitiveness, represented by Enkidu. Enkidu is so impressed with Gilgamesh's prowess that he praises the victor, and the two consequently swear an oath of mutual loyalty and become bosom friends for the rest of their lives. The replacement of armed opposition by brotherly embrace is found also in the stories of King Arthur and Lancelot, and of Robin Hood and Little John. Most examples of archetypal twins consist of pairs whose members are the same sex. But there are examples of co-sexual twins. In Greek myth, Apollo and Artemis, the god of the sun and the goddess of the moon, are twin offsprings of Zeus and the Titaness Leto. Japanese myth has the world, or at least the islands of Japan, which as far as Japanese mythology is concerned is the same thing as the world, created by a brother-sister pair, Izanagi and Izanami. An old standby of children's literature, which some of you may know, the Bobbsey twins books, describe the adventures of two sets of twins, each consisting of a brother and sister, the older Bert and Nan and the younger Flossie and Freddie. A more recent pair who are discovered to be twins are Luke Skywalker and Leia Organa of Star Wars. I'm mentioning things like Star Wars and Harry Potter to point out that mythology does not come to an end. It goes on, and the archetypes are continually re-embodied because of their power and importance, because of what they have to say to us. In addition to the twins I have just mentioned, both cooperating and contending, others are to be found in the myths of the West Africans, the Mayans, the Navajos, the Canaanites, the Sumerians, and many other cultures. Why twins are so widespread in literature and myth is a question to be asked. Jungianly speaking, we might say that twins represent the sense of a difference between our ego selves and some other self in us. The other may be a shadow figure or a better self with a capital S. It may be a mask or an anima or animus. Archetypically speaking, the twins are two aspects of ourselves. You and I are twins of one another, but also within ourselves. If we wish to transform ourselves, we must first recognize who we are. Such recognition is greatly aided by myths and stories, for all the archetypes are in us. By observing their interaction, we learn who and what we are, and most important, how we can change. The archetype of the twins also helps us to define our relationships with other human beings, either cooperating or contending. Cooperation and contention are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, as the myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu shows, ideally contention leads to fraternal cooperation. All human relationships involve both contention and cooperation. What is needed is a balance between those opposites. And that observation brings us to the point of my talk, Olcott and Blavatsky. Part 3, Olcott and Blavatsky as twins. Archetypes have a way of expressing themselves, not just in myths and literature, but in the lives of real people. In old diary leaves, Henry Steele Olcott, referring to Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and himself, famously declared, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, we used to speak of ourselves as the Theosophical twins. What does Olcott's statement mean? What can we conclude from his own words that he intended by that declaration? And what difference does it make? Those questions are the subject of the rest of my remarks this morning. With regard to ends and commitments, Olcott and Blavatsky were embodiments of the cooperating twins. And that is doubtless what Olcott had primarily in mind when he penned that line. But Olcott and Blavatsky were sharply different in other ways, and those differences sometimes led to their being embodiments of the contending twins. That combination of cooperation and contention is quite normal in human interrelationships. I will now just throw in a little side remark. When I was actually in my teen years, I worked in the Miami Public Library, and the reference librarian there once told me that in the 35 years of her marriage, she and her husband had never exchanged a crossword. I didn't believe her. I still don't believe her. Olcott and Blavatsky were alike in their total commitment to the work of the masters. Blavatsky's lifelong devotion to the masters was the theme of everything she did. And of Olcott, the master K.H. famously wrote, "Him can we trust under all circumstances. His faithful service is pledged to us, come well, come ill. Where can we find an equal devotion? He is one who may make innumerable mistakes out of excessive zeal, but never is unwilling to repair his fault, even at the cost of the greatest self-humiliation. Who esteems the sacrifice and comfort and even life as something to be cheerfully risked whenever necessary, who will eat any food or even go without, sleep on any bed, work in any place, fraternize with any outcast, endure any privation for the cause." It was such faithful service, devotion, and sacrifice that Olcott and Blavatsky shared, making them twins. They were the two chief founders of the Theosophical Society and the two chief framers of what modern theosophy was to become. Blavatsky on its inner theoretical side and Olcott on its outer applied side. Olcott himself says of their relationship, "She was the teacher, I was the pupil. She, the misunderstood and insulted messenger of the great ones. I, the practical brain to plan, the right hand to work out the practical details. Under the Hindu classification, she would be the teaching Brahmin, I, the fighting Kshatriya, warrior. Under the Buddhist one, she would be the bhikshu, the spiritual teacher, I, the working jhaka, or layperson." Neither the Theosophical Society nor Theosophy would be what it is today if it were not for the joint work of those theosophical twins. There existed, as Olcott says, and this is a quotation again from old diary leaves, there existed an indestructible focus of vitality in the quenchless enthusiasm of the two friends, the Russian woman and the American man, who were in deadly earnest, who never for a moment harbored a doubt as to the existence of their masters, the excellence of the delegated work, or the ultimate complete success that would crown it. The one thing we felt more and more as time went on was that we too could absolutely depend upon each other for theosophy, though the sky itself should crack, and beyond that, all else depended upon circumstances. The twinship of the two friends involved more than shared ideals. A psychic connection also united them. An example of that connection was recounted by Olcott in describing a dreadful fire that occurred near Adyar while HPB was in Europe. He said, "A dreadful tragedy occurred in People's Park, Madras, during the days of the December 1885 convention. Some 300 or 400 persons were burnt alive in a panic that seized them when some palm leaf shops and fences accidentally caught fire at the fair that was in progress. The reason for my mentioning this is that the wave of agony that it created in the astral light reached HPB in her lodgings in Belgium and threw her into the gravest excitement for our safety." He goes on, "This is a most instructive psychological phenomenon. The wave of agony of which I spoke touched Adyar, of course, first of all, being so near, and from me passed on to HPB, with whom I was spiritually so intimately connected. Similarly, when she died in London in 1891, I was made aware of it in Sydney, New South Wales. New South Wales? Yes. We used to call ourselves twins, and twins we were, so far as community of sympathies within the lines of our work was concerned. No great wonder, considering how we had worked together." Now, at times, some efforts were made by others to drive a wedge between the twins, but their commitment to each other and to the masters overcame all such efforts. In the course of one such divisive effort in 1887, Blavatsky wrote to Olcott from England, and Olcott records her message thus: "She begs me on the score of the real, more than fraternal affection she has for me, her internal, not external loyalty to me as her colleague, chum, and co-worker in master's work, to break up the Indian part of the conspiracy." In another letter she writes, "I love you more than anyone on earth save Master. My friendship and brotherly affection for you are eternal. And if you believe me capable of going back on you, let alone the TS, then you are a blank." Blavatsky had no inhibitions about her language. Olcott goes on, "Her use of the word eternal has a deeper meaning than appears on the surface, as those who have traced back the mutual relations between us two in past lives, both men and all of them, will understand. Suffice it to say that this is not the first time we have been closely associated in the evolutionary paths of our two entities." End of quote. Disagreements arose between Olcott and Blavatsky on several occasions. Those disagreements were partly fomented by people in Europe who admired Blavatsky and wanted to break the ties she had with Olcott and with Adyar. They were partly the result of a conflict between external and internal authority that was brought to a head by Blavatsky's intention to form an esoteric school answering to her alone. In 1888, Olcott took ship to England, intending to put down what he judged to be an incipient insurrection. On board ship, he received a letter from the master K.H., which included the following. HPB has next to no concern with administrative details and should be kept clear of them, insofar as her strong nature can be controlled. But this you must tell to all. With occult matters, she has everything to do. We have not abandoned her. She is not given over to chelas. She is our direct agent. I warn you against permitting your suspicions and resentments against her many follies to bias your intuitive loyalty to her. In the adjustment of this European business, this was at a time when Europe wanted to break away from the International Society and form its own independent group with HPB at its head. In the adjustment of this European business, you will have two things to consider: the external and administrative, and the internal and psychical. Keep the farmer under your control and that of your most prudent assistants jointly. Leave the latter to her. You are left to devise the practical details with your usual ingenuity. Only be careful, I say, when some emergent interference of hers in practical affairs is referred to you on appeal, to discriminate between that which is merely exoteric in origin and effects and that which, beginning on the practical, tends to beget consequences on the spiritual plane. As to the former, you are the best judge. As to the latter, she. The Master's comment defines, as well as anything can, the respective spheres, responsibilities, and mutual interaction of the two Theosophical twins. However, their mutual interaction is more than merely a historical fact. It is also a reflection of archetypal reality. Last part, the Theosophical twins and us. The archetypal twins stand for the relationship each of us should have with others. All of us are twins. We are as closely related with one another as it is possible to be, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. When we interact with one another, we will sometimes have conflicts, just as Olcott and Blavatsky did. But if we are inspired by the wise example of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, we will transform our conflicts with one another into cooperation, and our cooperation will be the stronger and the wiser for growing out of friendly conflict. That is precisely what happened in the lives of Olcott and Blavatsky. It is what needs to happen in each of us as we interact with our fellows. The archetypal twins also stand for two aspects inside each one of us. Our one aspect is our higher individuality, our archetype. The other aspect is our lower personality, the reflection in time and space of that individual archetype. Our personality's empirical and pragmatic mind has everything to do with the external and practical in our lives, just as Olcott did with the administrative affairs of the society. Our individuality's intuitive and noetic mind has everything to do with the internal and spiritual in our lives, just as Blavatsky did with the spiritual affairs of Theosophy. These two aspects of our nature, personality and individuality, are, as it were, our Olcott and Blavatsky, both necessary and indispensable, but each properly in charge of its own sphere within our lives. Olcott and Blavatsky, the Theosophical twins, are part of history, but as reflections of ahistorical, archetypical reality, they are also part of us. This is true because, as the Emerald Tablet says, what is below is like what is above, and what is above is like what is below, for the accomplishments of the wonders of the one thing. The one thing is the conscious realization of the unity of all existence, of our lower and higher selves, of each of us with every other, of all of us with the one reality that underlies all existence. In that realization are wonders indeed. And to achieve that realization, we can do no better than to follow in the archetypal footsteps of the Theosophical twins.
When you were talking about the individual, would you equate that with the monad? Or is that separate? Or how do you think of that?
Let's say they are related. The monad is a Greek word which simply means oneness. And the monad is the reflection in us of the one life, the one eternal reality. And it is, in a sense, the very core or heart of the individuality. But our individuality includes more than that. It includes the way in which that monad expresses itself through our archetype.
I'd like to know a little more about that blank. Is there a first letter?
In Old Diary Leaves, the blank is a blank. And Colonel Olcott leaves it to our imagination to fill it in.
Thank you.
Other questions?
That's the way.
Just one minute.
Is there a relationship between the twins and the schizophrenia that we're seeing now?
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Is there what did I just say? Thank you. Is there a relationship between the twins and the schizophrenia that we're seeing now? Is there a split?
The twins and the...
Schizophrenia that we're seeing in people.
Schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, in a sense, not only does modern psychology imply that we are more than one identity, that's good theosophical doctrine too, that we are a combination of things. That's what that creation myth I mentioned, which I think is very amusing, about the creation by a committee of the human constitution. The point of that really is that we are the result of the evolution of different aspects of our being, and they have quite different histories. And in a sense, any one of those aspects may become dominant and take over our lives. And that will result in what psychology calls schizophrenia, or can, I think. All right? So that, yeah, there's a relationship there. And then when that happens, of course, what happens is that the different parts of ourselves become contending twins, fighting to see who's going to rule. And what we want is cooperating twins, that all aspects of our nature are necessary. Karma, for example, this is a favorite subject of mine. Karma, K-A-M-A, has a bad reputation in theosophy, and it doesn't really deserve that. There is nothing wrong with karma. Desire is at the basis of the coming into existence of the universe. Desire is what motivates us in everything we do. It's just exactly like that misquotation of St. Paul, which says that money is the root of all evil, right? Money isn't the root of all evil. It's what we do with it that's a problem, right? It's good or bad according to how we use it. So karma is good or bad depending on how we use it. Now, there is great temptation to use it badly. So that's the way we think of it. But karma itself is perfectly fine. Everything which is holy, right? If it were not, it would not be, because everything which is comes from the one. Right? As the Hebrew prophet quotes God as saying, I am light and I am dark, I am good and I am evil. Evil being not something positive, but that yin-yang contrast. So yeah, I think there's a connection. They're looking at, I believe, the same thing in slightly different ways.
Other questions?
Is there an infinite number of archetypes?
Beg pardon?
Is there an infinite number of archetypes?
So far as I know, I don't know a count of them. I don't know an end of them, so that must mean that they're infinite as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. And it depends on what you mean by archetype, too. In the theosophical view. I suppose there must be a finite number of archetypes in the universe, but I have no idea what it would be. It must be huge.
Okay, other questions?
Can you please correlate or elaborate a little on the relation between the twins and the concept of duality, the Gnostic concept of polarities and duality?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Well, the twins are an archetype which expresses that general concept of polarity, which is, of course, in the second of the fundamental propositions in the secret doctrine. We have polarity in all things. And that's what the twins are really an embodiment of that general concept. And just as in a polarity, you have to have both poles for the thing to exist. So the twins are both necessary. The twins are a poetic concept to express an underlying reality. Right? And let me quote something here which I said in another group, a different group last week. There is a writer of whom I am very fond, who is an Australian by birth. Her name was Pamela Travers. Who here has heard of Pamela Travers? A couple of you, yes, all right. But many of you will know the series of books she wrote, either directly or through a movie version. They are a series of books about a nanny who was called Mary Poppins. All right? Now, actually, Pamela Travers was an expert, a specialist in archetypes. She edited, or she was an associate editor of, I think it was Gnosis magazine. She contributed many, many articles on the subject of world mythologies and archetypes in them. And she once said something very profound about archetypes and understanding archetypes, which I quote frequently. She said there are 3 rules for interpreting archetypes. The first rule is, do not take them literally. And the second rule is, do not take them literally. And the third rule is, do not take them literally. So the twins are archetypes, and we aren't talking about any kind of literal reality. We're talking about, in effect, a poetic expression of some deep underlying truth, which is what all archetypes are.
Can't quite remember what you said, John, with regards everything that comes into being is holy. I think that's, is that correct?
Everything which is holy.
Is holy. My question is, could you just explain what you mean by holy in that context?
All right. Sure. I should also explain what I mean by is. People made great fun of Bill Clinton, who in his trial said, it all depends on what is means. Right? They thought that was very funny because everybody knows what is means. You look up the verb to be, of which is a form, in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the greatest, longest, most authoritative dictionary of the English language, and you will find that its definition requires more pages than that of any other word in the English language. Huh? Everything depends on what is. All right, come back to your question. I tend to be an etymologist. So consequently, I think in in etymological terms. The word holy in modern English comes actually from the same root as the word whole, W-H-O-L-E, and the same root as the word hale or healthy. So to be hale, to be healthy, to be holy is to be whole, to be entire. That is to be related, right? Not to be isolated. So for me, holiness is the quality of being integrally connected and related to everything else. That's what I mean by holy, and saying that I didn't make up the saying everything which is holy. That's a common saying among religious philosophers. And what do I mean by is? Well, there are several things there are many things which is can mean. But one thing which it can mean is exists fundamentally and absolutely, not relatively. So everything which truly is connected with everything else. And that's what I mean by everything which is holy. Now you can get things out of place. Let's take, we're about running out of time. Let me give you a specific example which some of you will have heard before because I use it all the time, but good examples can't be wasted, right? Is selfishness good or evil? Evil. The answer is it depends. In a baby, in an infant, in arms, is that infant selfish or unselfish? Totally selfish. Has no thought for anything except itself. Right? Absolutely. Is that evil? No. It's necessary for the infant at that stage of its existence. Now, as the infant grows up to be a child, a teenager, an adult, if it continues to possess that selfishness, is the selfishness good or evil? It has become evil because it's out of place, right? It is not properly connected with everything else. Selfishness in the infant is properly connected with everything else because it's necessary for the infant's survival. But in an adult, it is not properly connected. So in the infant, it is holy, but in the adult, it is unholy. Does that help at all with what I mean by everything is holy? Never mind. Okay. Thank you all very much.